Okay. Hey, kids. This podcast brought to you quite tragically by the 2008 financial crisis, more or less. We're going to talk about drugs.
Yeah.
So I saw this cool quote that I liked. Actually, it was on a Twitter feed that I saw, and I meant to bring it up actually in the last podcast, and I forgot because when Eric had been asking, what's the point? What are we doing this podcast for?
Mm-hmm.
This came to mind. This struck me. The guy wrote, when people talk about traveling to the past, they worry about radically changing the present by doing something small, but barely anyone in the present really thinks that they can radically change the future by doing something small. That's a cool thought, right? I go to the past and it's like, oh God, I do any little thing and like the whole future is going to be changed. Everything, there's going to be this butterfly effect of madness and the whole world's going to be different. But you can do that right now. You can do that right now and radically change the future in theory.
Yeah, my mind's blown.
Well, and you take into the past and think
though,
about
right?
like really small things that people have done that have radically changed everything. Go back to like the assassination of Lincoln and how that
Well,
probably
that's not a small thing, but
Well, I mean, in human history, it's not that big, but it's changed our country for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that. This is totally off course from drugs, but I was reading.
We'll get the drugs, kids. Hang in there.
At some point. I was reading this week about how there's a Soviet submarine captain who had actual launch orders to launch his nukes at the U.S. and it was something like 20 nukes, like would have totally destroyed us. And he just refused to do it and refused to do it and refused and actually ended up getting court-martialed for it. But he basically saved the entire world by refusing that order, and it's totally insane.
I've heard a similar story, and I don't know if it's the same one, a different version of the same one, or if it's a different instance of that same thing, where there was a malfunction on Russian systems that showed American missiles coming to the Soviet Union, and the guy just assumed that it was an error, and he was like, "No,
this doesn't sound right.
This isn't right. I'm not gonna send my missiles like this." You know what I mean? Like, and yeah, you avert.
And what a strange predicament for like his superiors to be in too, because they're like, well, thank you for not nuking the world and killing us all, but also we have to fire you for not nuking the world and killing us all. It's pretty wild.
I mean, maybe, yeah. It is interesting when you read how close we were to nuclear war, but I also kind of wonder from time to time, how close were we really? Is it possible that we exaggerate a little bit the history of how close we were to nuclear war in certain instances? I mean, you hear about the instance you're talking
Cuban
about.
Missile Crisis,
the Cuban Missile Crisis is the one
wild.
that's most often referenced, right? And it's one of those ones where I think, well, okay, I kind of want to be there because
we fired warning shots over the bow of Russian ships that were taking missiles and supplies to Cuba. That's crazy.
It is crazy, but I mean, there's a difference between going to war and going to nuclear war.
True.
And I guess that's my question: is if you know for a fact, as both sides did, that it's mutually assured destruction, the second you press that button that you are destroying both of you.
Well, I think you can kind of game theory it too, to the point where, okay, so whoever starts to lose a conventional war immediately just starts nuking. Like once foreign invaders are on your soil and it looks like you're going to lose, you're just going to flip the board.
I mean, maybe. But there's a difference because it's a question of what you lose, right? If you decide, there's a difference between I'm going to flip the board and the game's over, but I'm still alive. And if I flip the board, then there is nuclear war, a nuclear holocaust on my soil. I mean, to me,
all crazy.
If I'm even a general, right, and I'm thinking in terms of what I want the future of my country to be like, as I am in the midst of losing a war, and I know for a fact that these terms are going to be dictated by my enemy. Well, I'm still not necessarily going to say, screw it. I'm willing to let my entire country get nuked just so that we end up on a level playing field.
I guess it'd be fun to bring in a general from the 1960s or 70s and see what they would have done.
Maybe this is a sign we should move on to drugs.
Yeah.
So let's do that. So we were going to talk about the war on drugs, and we were also going to talk about the benefits of drugs. And David brought up, interestingly, I think quite relevantly, and at this point I would have to argue accurately that that's two extremely different and, disparate really topics. And I spent a decent amount of time discussing both, researching both, just on the off chance that we go in one direction or the other. and we can go in either direction that you guys want. But I'll tell you that I think at this point, I was sort of planning on being like, oh, I want to be able to play devil's advocate against whomever I'm speaking. And man, it is, there's some beauty to it in that it's not that complicated. But then when you get down into that, like as soon as you say that, you realize, well, it's a little complicated. But there is some common sense. There are some common sense things that all the evidence seems to point to indicate that, man, even if
we have the worst policy available.
We have bad policy. We have bad policies when it comes to drugs. We just do. And there's a lot of misinformation that goes out for sure. I will say I don't think it's quite as simple as just saying, well, let's legalize everything. And I don't think it's as I certainly don't think it's as simple as saying, well, let's just stick with what we've got.
I would also think that
because it's not, by the way.
There's like marijuana and there's everything else. I mean, you have latest polls I've seen is like 60% plus of Americans want marijuana legalized, and it's completely insane that on the federal level it's still illegal. They won't at least let the states kind of do what they want. I mean, they do in practice so far, but to be Schedule I is, I mean, completely nuts.
I agree,
and everyone seems to know that, but nothing changes. Why is that?
I mean,
that's a fun rabbit hole to go down.
No, it is for sure, and I think, well, you could make a similar case. I think for. Well, I don't want to get off topic, but I think you could make a similar case for sanctions working or not working. I think you could make an easy case on that with why haven't we been trading with Cuba for however long we haven't been trading with Cuba when we're trading actively with Vietnam and other countries like that.
Probably not the reasons they were being told.
Well, I think a lot of it, I mean, almost certainly yes, but I think also at the same time though, there's a social memory with these things. There's a lot of people who feel very strongly, even if it's a minority of people that feel extremely strongly about it. Well, I mean, if you're just some random dude, right? If 50%, 70% of the country just doesn't really care, they don't know and they don't care. Why aren't we trading with Cuba? Who cares? And then 20 to 30% of the country is rabidly against it. Maybe because they were persecuted by, Fidel Castro or whatever it is.
And the special interest angle for sure too.
Yeah. Well, I think drugs have that same issue where, you talk. I had this with my parents, where I talked to my parents about the fact that I took mushrooms. I've taken mushrooms twice, and both times have been amazing, incredible experiences for me. And I talked to my parents about that. Now, my parents are good Christian, they're God-fearing people, and they're good conservative. They're wonderful parents, and they fit the American mold, and I think that they grew up sort of with the standard agenda. I don't mind calling it an agenda, but they've been. We've all been to. I guess I don't want to use the word brainwashed, of course, because that makes me sound a little.
I think it's relevant.
But it's accurate. I mean, you grow up in a paradigm. You grow up with a certain. There is a sort of social. Well, whatever you want to call ideology, really, for lack of a better word, that we all grow up with, and our ideology is tainted with certain ideas and ideals, and some of those are great, and some of those are okay, and some of them are bad. But even the ones that are bad, okay, so our policy on drugs is maybe misguided, but it's not. It doesn't come from a bad place. I really don't think, actually.
I disagree. I think if you look into the actual. I guess I should have done my homework, but if you look into the actual history of a lot of these drugs and see why they were criminalized at the state and then federal level, you'll see just fairly blatant racism.
That's what I've been told, actually.
And
yeah.
I mean, in my history class American history class in college, my professor, God bless him, just he went off on this tangent for like 3 weeks of just like passing over tons of other stuff just to kind of ingrain in us the actual history of all this stuff. And it's pretty wild. And there's some stats out there, and I'm sure I'll butcher them a little bit, but the one that stuck with me the most was that in the 1980s, if you got caught with, I think it was like 1 gram of crack cocaine, that was the same federal punishment as if you got caught with like half a kilo of actual cocaine. And the only difference being that the black community was more involved with crack, and the white party goers were snorting up their nose, so the government didn't care near as much. And it's unbelievable that if you add baking soda to a drug, suddenly you get 1,000 times the punishment.
Right.
It's completely insane.
Well, so I've got some stats on both of those things.
Great.
As a matter of fact, yeah. So I really didn't go down the rabbit hole of racism in drug history and drug law and things like that. Although I saw it referenced numerous times, and there are enough stats to indicate that even if it's not intentional, which I suspect very strongly that it is, even if it weren't, it's still the case that at this point it's
how
being affected that way, right?
Out.
It's how it plays out, exactly. So nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are Black or Latino, which, I mean, nearly 80%. That's an insane number. So the 2012 Booker report makes the claim that Black male offenders receive sentences on average 19.1% longer than similarly situated white male offenders during the post-report period, fiscal years 2012 to 2016, as they had for the prior 4 periods studied. The differences in sentence length remained relatively unchanged compared to the post-Gaul period. Now, of course, that references some other stuff, but that was the relevant fact that Black male offenders in a similar situation to white male offenders received sentences on average 19.1% longer. And yeah, I mean, it's significant. And if you...
That's pretty bad.
Yeah, it is bad. It is bad. I mean, of course, if you actually look through, and of course, I admit, I just scanned this report because...
this is surface level stuff that we haven't dug in, like...
Sure. And another thing I'd like to point out, by the way, I've got a lot of statistics here. One of the things I discovered as I dug into some of this stuff is that when you read something in an article and it references something, so you go to the actual reference to read, okay, well, what are the details of what it's actually talking about? And one of the things that you find is that a lot of these stats are, okay, well, this study gives these numbers and this study gives those numbers. So it's all kind of ballparked. And maybe that's okay to a certain extent.
I just can't get over that 19% longer sentences. Like, I can't figure out how to... I mean, a lot of the stats you hear and you think, okay, well, that's not taking into this factor or this factor or this factor, but it's like, you get caught with a certain amount of drugs, you're dealing, whatever.
Yeah.
And you're the black or white. And
they point out similarly situated white male offenders. So they talk about the areas where it's like, okay, well, what about potential previous, violent crimes that were committed or other factors related, right? I mean, and this is something you expect that I mean, this is one of the areas where you can bend stats left and right? Well,
and I wonder what, like, how similarly they really are. Who knows?
I got the impression when I read over this as quickly as I did, however, that they were at least taking all of these things into consideration. It's like when they say similarly situated there.
What was the source on that?
The 2012 Booker report. You can look it up. You can look that up. But again, there's that stems from a Supreme Court case. There's some guy named, let's see if I don't have written down, but as I recall, there was some sort of situation where some guy allowed. I'm actually gonna botch this, so I'm not gonna say. In any case, it's based on a Supreme Court ruling. But the other thing that you were talking about was the scheduling. Okay, so there's different schedules for each drug, from 1 to I think 6, maybe. From 1 to I have it
5,
here.
but
1 to 5. You're right. 1 to 5. Excuse me. And they are based here. I've got it right here. Controlled Substances Act. Okay, it's part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970. It is the legal cornerstone of the government's war against drug abuse. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, right, has divided these substances into 5 categories called schedules based on each drug's 1, potential for abuse. Now, I mean, keep these in mind, because I think you'll find that they weigh some of these quite differently.
They're so stupid.
1, potential for abuse. 2, safety. I mean, there's so much ambiguity here as well. 3, addictive potential. And 4, whether or not it has any legitimate medical applications. Now, Schedule 1 drugs.
None of the above.
First of all, I would just like to point out that Schedule 1 drugs are basically, it's the worst you can get. This is the worst of the worst, okay? Some you expect. Heroin. Some you're not sure about because there's not.
I wouldn't put heroin. I mean, I would put nothing Schedule 1 just about. I wouldn't think.
Okay. I mean, let's assume that nothing Schedule 1 means everything would be Schedule 2, which we might as well make a Schedule 1. So at the end of
it's a stupid schedule.
Agreed. I'm not trying to defend the scheduling thing here. I'm trying to dismantle it. I'm just saying that we can do it reasonably. Heroin, I would like to point out, is in the same boat as peyote. which are two entirely different drugs. Peyote has been used for all kinds of spiritual purposes
for literally ever.
Yeah, and heroin has its own slew of problems with it.
Thing,
and to put them together is a little weird.
Slightly different.
Ecstasy is in there, which is, by the way, the party drug where people go out and they just listen to music and they drink a lot of water and they touch and feel themselves.
When these drugs first came to be on this list, what is the name of the list? It is the list of the, well, it is basically part of the Controlled Substances Act. Okay.
So it is part of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970.
Did they have reasons that were published for each drug that kind of describe why they meet those criteria, or they just kind of announced
that's a good question. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked because I kind of want to finish the point here, but I will say that when I read one of the things I read was a recent DEA report on on the discussion of legalization of drugs, because of course it's been a bit more of a hot button topic as there have been states that have come out and legalized. And I'd like to point out, by the way, that one thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot is that there were about 5 or 6 states in the 70s that decriminalized drugs. Certainly marijuana. Yeah. So if you look,
I thought Alaska did.
Alaska did.
Yeah.
Well, Alaska is an interesting one because Alaska's is based actually on there was a law of some sort, and then there was a Supreme Court ruling, an Alaska Supreme Court ruling on it that ended up kind of being the last word for a while until it was formally criminalized, or I should say perhaps recriminalized, I guess, in the 90s, or I think actually in 1990 itself. And then there was another Supreme Court, or not a Supreme Court ruling, excuse me, there was another court ruling on it around or up to somewhere in the 90s, or 2000, 2001, or something like that. Up to 2001, at least, there had been no Supreme Court ruling on it, and I think that might still be the case. Because they just haven't heard the case.
I think I thought it was totally legal.
But the recent court hearings on it have basically effectively decriminalized it again.
Nice.
So yeah, and again, that's what you see, by the way, in the Netherlands, where it's
technically illegal.
It's technically illegal, exactly. But they just don't really enforce it.
Well, in certain zones. So I might have been there in October, gone to the Rolling Stones concert. The guy in front of me got his joints taken away from him because he just thought that, he's American. He thought, it's totally legal in this country, whatever, and just had him like hanging out of his shirt pocket. And some cop walked up to him and was like, "Dude, you can't take those in here. I'm taking those." And he's like, "Oh, damn it!" And everyone else was just kind of like, "You didn't hide those? Are you kidding me? There's no search going on. You just can't show them that you're smoking weed."
Yeah, and 10 minutes later, they saw that same security cop.
Probably smoking, yeah.
Yeah, stoned out of his mind. But yeah, and interestingly enough, so there was one instance with mushrooms where they decided that mushrooms would be legal. Of course, we're talking about magic mushrooms, psilocybin.
That was Alaska?
This is actually the Netherlands.
Oh.
And
yeah, you can buy them there.
And you can buy them there, but for a while it was officially on the books legal. And in 2007, a French underage girl on vacation in Amsterdam got mushrooms from her friend, purchased by her friends. She took she obviously partook of the mushrooms, and then she went on the roof of the Nemo, which is a public building there, I think in Amsterdam, and she actively jumped off. They say she committed suicide by jumping off the building and dying. I don't know if they have any witnesses that suggest that, okay, yes, she was committing suicide, or she was hallucinating and thought something, it was a super weird bad trip and leapt or something like that. I don't know.
It's amazing that that's the standard, though, if they're going to ban something on that. It's like, how many drunk people have jumped off of buildings?
Agreed. I mean, I completely agree. And that's a whole nother topic maybe about how...
how do alcohol and nicotine score on those criteria?
Oh, bad. I mean,
they must be
horrible.
So it's another thing, by the way, that I've got stats on that I'll talk about. But real quick, so the issue here was that, so her parents said that they held the state responsible.
Jesus.
Because the sale of mushrooms was legal. And so they said, well, the state is responsible for our daughter's death, which is yet another podcast in waiting, the ridiculousness of that claim. Although there may be a flip side of that story too, where there may have been some, well, I'm
pretty comfortable with the parents just being lunatics on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent here, but I just want to say that, is there a chance that a lawyer came to them and they said, look, listen, We get it. You don't want to sue the state, but you got bills here. You got issues here, and this could happen to other people, and blah 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 blah. Right? Like you have a
scare factor. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I mean? They're gonna settle with you anyways. It's gonna pay for your funeral costs. You know what I mean? It's gonna pay for your therapy. You know what I mean? Like this is a no-brainer, and they might have been talked into it that way. I don't know. Anyways, nonetheless, right? This is something you think of as American litigation craziness, and yet here it is here. Well,
right.
What happens? 2008, the very next year, of course, the Netherlands banned the sale of mushrooms. But as with all of their other soft drugs, there is no enforcement of this, as you know, basically whatsoever. And of course, that was the first place I ever took mushrooms. By the way, was with our good friend.
And I was talking to the people in our shop about that, about the legality of it. And by the way, they sell peyote and all kinds of other wild stuff there now. But they told me that they can't. The letter of the law says they can't sell actual mushrooms, so they have to sell. What is it? Truffles. It's actually truffles, so it's not an actual mushroom that you're getting, because the word didn't. The law didn't specify psilocybin. It just said psychedelic mushrooms or something like that. And so that's how they're kind of able to get around it. Is what I was told.
I read something similar to that. Although, and we'll have to ask. Quite frankly, we'll have to ask Stuart about this, because what I thought was that I had gotten actual mushrooms, and that what he had gotten was truffles.
Oh, interesting.
No, I don't know. My experience on it, whatever it was fantastic. And of course, I did a bunch of homework as well, and have a bunch of interesting stats on mushrooms as well. But these things are. This is the one thing I think, even more than marijuana, even though marijuana use is quite prevalent, and psychedelic use is not
less so,
decidedly less so. So one of the things I want to do is compare mushrooms to pot, but I also want to compare pot to alcohol, which was your point. And you want to talk about, I mean, compared to alcohol, you can throw pot and mushrooms into the same bucket all day, because alcohol, I'm not saying that alcohol should be illegal. But man, if you were to just scratch everything and come up with new drug laws based on the actual data,
gone.
You would never legalize alcohol. You would never do it. And you would absolutely legalize mushrooms, and you would very probably legalize marijuana. But, well, I mean, we can go over a lot of that stuff. But anyways, so here's the interesting thing. Now, again, take all of these stats with at least a slight grain of salt, because the more I looked into them, the more I found slightly disparate stats for all of these things, which is a little bit weird, but you know, they all have their different polls and their different margins of error and their different people that they're polling, etc. But anyways, around 70% of American adults are current alcohol drinkers. 50 now current alcohol, which means within the year. It's that they've had alcohol at least within the year. 50 to 56% roughly within the month, depending on where you go. So at least 50 to 56. Now, I actually thought these were kind of low, and they're high, but I actually thought they were quite low.
You also live in Austin, though.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe that's true. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So 80 to 86% have tried alcohol at least once in their lives, which means that up to 20% at least, because I saw some other stats that hinted that it might have been higher. So we'll say 20 to 30, but at least you could bank on at least 24 to 20, or excuse me, 16 to 20% have never even tasted. They've never even tried alcohol.
That's for people that are
crazy.
Of legal drinking age?
You got to eat the mic.
Is this for people of legal drinking age?
Yes. Yeah, it says American adults.
Is it broken down by age at all? Or, I mean, are people that are two generations, that are 16 over, like, have much lower numbers than that or something?
You can find. With alcohol, I didn't dig that deep into the numbers, but you can find a lot of breakdowns in a lot of these things, especially the drugs. So and in fact, they point out that drug abuse is generally a teens to 20s kind of thing for drug abuse, which I think kind of makes sense. You look at college and you look
including alcohol, or
now that I don't know.
Okay,
that I don't know. That's a good question,
because I feel like alcohol's got to be the most commonly used drug.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, certainly. Well, it's just, I mean, if nothing else, it is the most commonly used. Well, okay, unless
we're going to throw nicotine in there too.
Yeah,
nicotine is different, and I did not look up nearly. In fact, I looked up almost no research on nicotine, to be completely upfront. But going back to the alcohol thing, I will say that the top 10% of drinkers, the top 10% consume. Actually, do you want to just take a guess how many drinks per week or per day, if you'd prefer, the top 10% of drinkers in America drink?
I'll ballpark what I do, I guess.
Oh, jeez. Well, you might, maybe.
I'd shoot for 8 to 10, but I feel like I'm about to get
8 to 10 a day.
A day for the
10%? Top 10%. Man, that's impressive.
Very modest.
It's 10, no. It's 10. It's 74 drinks a week, 10 a day.
Wow, that's the top 10%.
That's the top 10%.
So it's like 7% of America or something.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, so in the
That's crazy.
That particular study suggested that up to 30% of Americans don't drink. So again, you've got some discrepancy there between 20 and 30%.
So 10% of 70%.
Right. Would be what 7%. You end up with. I'm no good at numbers, but I just have to. If I can't read the stats, then I'm screwed. But yes, it would be.
So 7% of Americans drink 10 drinks a day. Is what that sounds outrageous.
Yeah.
But maybe. I don't know.
Well, and
I'm feeling a lot better.
Well, and I wonder how much of this, if this is, I mean, they don't have stats from purchases or anything like this. They can't. They rely on
self-reporting,
polls.
So it's probably
low.
Self-reporting,
so it might be low. Exactly.
There's also like religious communities, Salt Lake City probably has a very low percentage of drinkers,
for sure. But there was a huge. So those were the two biggest factors by far, were age and religion. Those were the two biggest factors, not just with drinking, but with marijuana. So interestingly enough, more than half of American adults have tried marijuana at least once in their lives, according to this one survey. Nearly 55 million of them, or 22%, currently use it. Currently being any time they've used it at least once within the last year, and 35 million are regular users. Now, now this can vary significantly based on the poll, because I found another poll that indicated 19.8 million. That was the NIDA poll. And another, according to the 2015 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, was 22.2 million. Again, age and religion were significant factors. There was a huge difference, a huge discrepancy between those who who identified themselves as churchgoers and those who did not go to church. So if you compare that with the alcohol numbers, yes, they're lower, but they're not lower by significant amounts. Whereas if you go down, so like psychedelics, for example, I found a stat that on a study that indicated that around 32 million Americans were lifetime psychedelics users in America, and by lifetime I mean they have used it at least once in their life.
32 million.
So that's
surprisingly high.
It's high, but it's people again. It's not
low.
current. It's not current users. I would have said high.
Lifetime.
Well, it's about 13%. Well, and maybe so. Again, I guess depending on.
We also live in Austin,
right? In Austin, maybe it feels.
Yeah.
So that's lifetime psychedelics. Now I could not find regular psychedelics users. It doesn't mean that. I mean, some of this stuff I didn't.
And how do you define that and all that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm not going to spend. I had a week to do this research. I wasn't going to spend.
Thank you, by the way.
Oh yeah. No, this was really interesting. I learned a lot. Heroin use, by the way, today. Heroin use within the year. People have used it at least once within the year. Was 0.3 to 1.6% of.
That sounds about right.
Of American adults.
Well, I keep hearing the stat and seeing that.
And only 2% lifetime users.
Yeah.
Only 2% of Americans have used it even once in their life. That's quite low. And meth use is about 4% today, depending on the poll you look at.
4% meth?
3 to 4%. It was 3%. That's the same poll gave it 3% in 2010. But that's a growing number because apparently there's a bit of a meth epidemic. But the fact that there's an epidemic and you're still talking about 4%.
What
now,
the
4%
news calls an
high,
epidemic and what's actually happening are probably two different things. Like the summer of the shark in 2008 or 10 or whatever it was, when there were actually fewer shark attacks than most years, and they just didn't have any news. They're like, "Oh, fuck it, shark attack summer."
Yeah,
and
that's true. The media drives a lot of this,
and the DEA wants funding, so they're going to tell the reporters to report on this crazy epidemic and stir up everybody to give them more money.
Well, and that was the scary thing: was reading this DEA report was. There were very few facts or references to facts or studies, and there was a lot of fear mongering. And I remember reading it, and I remember thinking, I've been looking through a lot of stats, a lot of data. I've been listening to a lot of scientists. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts that were, talking to scientists.
You don't trust your government, John?
Yeah, I mean, it's
almost like they have their own agenda.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not representative of you.
I hate to sound like you, Calvin, but yes, I'm beginning.
Most people do.
I'm beginning to doubt my trust in my government. But But yes. So, anyways, it was shocking, I think, to hear because
I don't think it's that shocking, but I'm a lot more cynical than you.
It probably shouldn't. And I came up with some arguments against, because I wanted to kind of be thorough and I wanted to look at both sides.
We should have brought a DEA agent on this thing.
We should have.
That would have been fun.
Well, I wonder how fun it would be, because if we're really talking about, I mean, I don't mean to suggest that no DEA agent has good stats or facts on this stuff, but
But if they just sat here and raged out about talking about this, it'd be pretty.
It would be interesting. It would make for good. It would make for good, radio, I guess, for lack of a better. What does podcast count as? Radio?
Yeah, radio's good.
Okay, we'll go with radio. It makes for good internet. How's that?
Interwebs.
So, but I did come up with some. I came up with some arguments. It's sort of some concerns, right? Some concerns about. Well, I will say this. I came up with almost no concerns for psychedelic. I don't want to say psychedelics. Here's another thing that was interesting, by the way, as a side note. They lumped pretty much any psychedelic in with all other psychedelics. So mushrooms was the same as LSD, was the same as like ketamine and like all this. They just lumped all these things together. And then they would say, oh, there's these problems and those problems and those problems.
Wait,
but then when you dig...
Ketamine is Schedule 1? Because we were using that as painkillers in Vietnam. Which is why everyone had so many like
marijuana is also used as a painkiller, and it is still Schedule 1.
Well, but not legally, federally.
Right, not legally and not federally. Okay, ketamine, I couldn't tell you what that falls under as far as the scheduling.
That would be amazing if that's Schedule 1.
But I will say that when I was looking up this stuff, they were, and I don't quote me on this, but I'm about 75% sure that I remember seeing ketamine listed as and actually I can see, so ketamine is actually a Schedule 3 drug, by the way. I'm seeing it here.
So how is pot a Schedule 1 drug?
So I have an answer for that.
So hold on. So cocaine. So that was what I never really finished this argument. Marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug. Cocaine, and
so actually
cocaine is a Schedule 2 drug because it is listed as having medical benefits.
It has one.
That's
recognized. Painkillers for your eyes. When they're doing surgery.
Well, so apparently the fact that it is a local anesthetic, as well as the fact that it also lowers or increases blood pressure by constricting blood vessels is a unique quality to cocaine, apparently. So there is some medical benefit to that. But the medical benefits to marijuana are significant. And yet, interestingly enough, part of the problem with changing it from Schedule 1, and this is kind of, it's either funny or tragic, depending on how you want to think about it. But I read this on a number of instances. Part of the reason, and in fact, I think that the DEA actually has a statement stating this. In fact, I think I might even put that statement down. Okay, so here is, why are they changing the scheduling? The FDA I believe this is from the DEA, but don't quote me on that. The FDA requires maybe it was from the FDA. The FDA requires carefully conducted studies, clinical trials, in hundreds to thousands of human subjects to determine the benefits and risks of a possible medication. So far, researchers haven't conducted enough large-scale clinical trials that show that the benefits of the marijuana plant, as opposed to its cannabinoid ingredients, outweigh its risks in patients it's meant to treat. Now, of course,
what are they saying the risks are?
Well, so I wrote all of that down as well. But so what's interesting about this is that they're talking about how it's like, oh well, there just aren't enough. There's not enough data. There's not enough.
Well, they can't do any tests because it's Schedule 1. It's circular bullshit logic.
Precisely the issue. They can't do all of these tests because it is Schedule 1, and they're not allowed to.
Well, and I think this all goes back to Nixon versus the hippies, and the hippies are all smoking weed, and he was like, man, these are my enemies. We got to get rid of them, and be able to lock them up whenever we want to, and they all smoke weed, so
which, by the way, is attributed to the reason that the states... There were about 5 or 6, as I said, in the 70s that started to decriminalize.
Yeah, the Fed wouldn't have it.
And the Feds basically clamped down, and the states started to kind of be like, oh, okay, well, let's not do any more of this.
Was it a similar deal where they were taking away funding, kind of like they did with the drinking age? How like Louisiana held out to like 1998 or something? And their roads are total shit still. Where they were like, nah, it's 18. Screw you guys.
I have to confess, I don't know. I
like to think that it's like that.
Yeah, but I mean, it might be. It would not surprise me. But I really just don't know. But this is an interesting. This is a quote from the DEA. It's a bit of a more pessimistic viewpoint on why we haven't switched the scheduling, as if you needed an even more pessimistic viewpoint than what I already gave you. This is a report from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. It's a statement in the 2010 DEA report on drugs and on legalizing drugs, And this is a quote. This is a direct quote. "The simple truth is that legalizing narcotics will not make life better for our citizens, ease the level of crime and violence in our communities, nor reduce the threat faced by law enforcement officers. To suggest otherwise ignores reality. There is it goes on.
My God.
There is a reason why the International Association of Chiefs of Police and every major law enforcement organization opposes efforts at drug legalization or decriminalization. We are public safety experts.
Yeah.
Who have witnessed firsthand
no doubt.
the damage and horror that drug abuse visits on society. We have witnessed the lost promise of a child who becomes addicted to drugs and whose life descends into the never-ending hell of dependency and squalor. We have viewed the pain and anguish on the faces of parents and relatives who have lost a loved one due to a drug overdose. Far from being the answer to these problems, drug legalization will condemn tens of thousands of our fellow citizens to a life of dependency and horror and endanger the lives of countless innocent others who share the roads and their communities." Unquote.
They sound really scared that they might lose some income, but it's so I would have 2 points. We've been down this road before with alcohol, and when prohibition came along, I mean, it's night and day. That's when organized crime got a foothold in, just like the cartels right now. We got rid of it. You didn't see Coors Light and Budweiser shooting it out in the streets. Like, it's total insanity to think that violence would go up with at least decriminalization, if not legalization. That's actually totally insane, and it flies in the face of history. And I can't imagine how anyone who is being honest with themselves could come to that conclusion.
Well, and it flies in the face of facts, I would argue, too. And I mean, when you look at the comparison, the irony... Now, I will say that there was one consistency that I saw with the DEA's case, was that they sort of said, look, alcohol is legal, but we're not saying that alcohol ought to be legal. I mean, I think if they had their way, they would just make illegal everything that they conceivably could. They're
totally off.
But it's at least fair enough that they're at least consistent enough to say they can at least say, okay, well, look, they didn't say we would make it illegal, but they certainly implied that they would make it illegal.
The chief also thinks that drug laws actually have anything to do with addiction rates or hardcore drug users, and it doesn't seem to. Last time I looked at it, I think it was about 2.5% of the population is addicted to hardcore drugs before the war on drugs, and that graph hasn't changed at all in the last 40 years, and it's still about 2.5%, 3%. It goes back and forth a little bit per decade, but if you put the graph of the amount of money that we've wasted on the war on drugs over that, and I think we're up to 3 or 4 trillion now, something like that. It's complete insanity that we keep upping our spending more and more and more, and total addiction rates are flatlined and have been flatlined for as far back as data can be found.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I think I've got some data on that too.
Nice.
So the amount spent annually in the U.S. on the war on drugs, I got all this from a single source.
And you have to use, what year's dollars are they using too?
This study was from, it looks like 2016.
But usually they put it in like $2,000 or $1990 or something like that.
It didn't
specify.
It didn't specify.
So we'll say $2016 probably.
Yeah. I assume so, right? So amount spent annually in the U.S. war on drugs was $50+ billion per year. The number of arrests in 2016 in the U.S. for drug law violations was over 1.5 million. So 1,572,579. The number of arrests that were for possession only was 1,249,025. Think about that. The vast majority of those were just for possession of drugs. It doesn't say marijuana specific. It's 84% of them. The number of people arrested. Oh, here you go. The number of people arrested for a marijuana law violation in 2016 was 653,249. And the number of those charged with marijuana law violations who were arrested for possession only was 89% of that, 574,641. I mean, it
seems like a jobs program for law enforcement.
This is ludicrous when you think about it. I don't.
And correctional facilities.
I don't want to get super conspiracy theory on it, but it's
there's
enough.
No other...
Suffice it to say, the stats are ugly. and they're not. It is difficult to make the case that we should. It is just so.
I think Big Pharma is really scared too.
I think that's absolutely the case. I don't mean to say because there's a difference. I think honestly between saying that. Well, there's a number of different questions here. One is should all drugs be legal versus should marijuana be legal or should psychedelics be legal?
I would say
and
it's
even those
two
are very
different issues. At least get marijuana federally decriminalized. If the states want to criminalize it, fine, move to another state. Who cares? Like, I don't give a shit.
No, I think that's fair.
But the feds have no business in this whatsoever. And in fact,
at this point, I agree.
It's I would say every federal drug law is actually unconstitutional. Just because you had a Supreme Court that ruled that 2 + 2 = 7,000 doesn't make it true. Interstate Commerce Clause does not go to this. I mean, we had enough respect for the Constitution with alcohol that we had to pass a constitutional amendment. What's the difference now?
So that's a whole other podcast. First of all,
but I think it sneaks into this one.
Okay, but it is relevant to this one at least to the extent that I was going to say
they should all be null and void. All federal drug laws should be null and void. Period.
Even if I don't agree with you on the reason that you're getting there, well, because in truth, I don't think that all laws,
constitutional.
I see your point. I'm not going to. I don't want to make. I think the constitutional question is a whole other podcast. I really do, but I will say that it is extremely notable that when we passed the amendment, the constitutional amendment,
the 17th, 18th, something like that.
18th. You'd think I would.
I think it's
remember
18th.
This. 18th, maybe. Yeah, that might be right. When we passed the amendment that this is where we need somebody looking up stuff for us. When we passed the amendment that thank you, David. You're a scholar and a gentleman. When we passed the amendment that made it illegal for that basically outlawed alcohol, the sale, and I think the consumption, all that stuff.
It's the exact same scenario.
It was done because the 18th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Nailed
so
it.
it was done with nice work. It was done with the assumption that such an amendment was required to be able to pass such a law.
Because we actually respected the Constitution, which
Yes.
we no longer do.
Okay, so again, another podcast, but suffice it to say that the fact that we thought that it was necessary then is a telling point. And then, after the fact, we repeal that amendment, and instead of passing another similar amendment that causes us to, or that allows us to make
regulate drugs
similarly illegal.
We just said, nah, fuck you guys.
Yes, basically. We basically just kind of were like, well, this time let's just do it the easy way, because
we've gained enough federal power at this point that no one's going to stop us, and that's just all there is to it.
Now moving on, the number. This is interesting.
I don't want to move on, John.
Okay, I'm telling you it's another podcast. All right. I'm telling you it's another podcast. It's a whole podcast. We can go off on that.
On the 10th Amendment alone would be amazing.
Sure, we could probably go through each amendment and do a whole podcast. But so the number of students who have lost federal financial aid eligibility because of a drug conviction is over 200,000 people. Did you even know that was a thing?
I did know that was a thing.
The number of students who have lost federal financial aid eligibility because of a drug conviction.
Yeah, if you want to get like a Pell Grant, if you qualify for a Pell Grant or other stuff.
What is
if
the
you've
logic
ever
behind that?
I have no idea.
The logic...
Are you trying to put logic and the federal government in the same box? Because that's not going to work.
I really think that there's this moral sort of agenda, kind of almost this idea of how things should work instead of the way things do actually work.
But I think their thinking is like, well, this kid, he knows he might lose his Pell Grant in 3 years that he's not even thinking about and hasn't even applied for yet. So he better not smoke some weed if he thinks he's going to get this, which doesn't even enter into a 15-year-old's
maybe the idea
brain
is that,
whatsoever.
If you are a criminal, you're less deserving of it than someone who's not a criminal. But they could make those. You shouldn't be ineligible. A crime that shouldn't have been a crime.
Well, so if you stole a car, you're still eligible for this. I mean, I actually don't know if that's true.
I don't know if it's true.
There's plenty of other crimes. I mean, this one was singled out for.
I suspect this one was singled out, although I didn't do the research on it. But I suspect that that's true, and I would like to point out that there are people who are already determining your eligibility. They can determine whether your crime is worthy of. I mean, look, I consider myself a pretty rare guy that I didn't smoke any pot until I was 32. And that, I think, makes me quite the exception amongst all of my friends. And all of my friends are extremely, like, they're the kind of people you want in your society. They're hardworking, they're smart, they're honest, they're good friends, they're good people. They're hard workers. These are things that you expect out of the best of society. I feel like I have those kinds of friends in my life, and I suspect that almost none of them are not at least minor pot users. I mean, this, some of the people I would identify as the most model citizens are at least semi-regular pot users. I mean, at some point we need to.
Well, we still have these laws based in the fear of hippies from the 1960s and 70s that's just never been changed, because I think it's two things. I think bureaucracy, the DEA wants to keep getting paid and they want their budget going up every year, but I think that's a lot less than the pharmaceutical industry also doesn't want people to be able to smoke a plant and relax, or cure their insomnia, or whatever. There are a lot of legitimate uses. I'm not one of those guys who's like, well, pot actually cures everything. It cures cancer. No, it doesn't. But it does help with a lot of things. And their sales would, without a doubt, go down. There's zero doubt about that. And then also you do have the religious lobby who's mad at weed because whatever. And so those are all three fairly powerful forces.
Yeah.
That are all kind of against logic and reason.
Well, and there's the number of states, by the way, that agree with you and have allowed the medical use of marijuana are 29 plus the District of Columbia. 29 allow for medical marijuana use, and these I have not confirmed that these are updated numbers. So I guess it's conceivably even more if it's happened recently, but this is a fairly recent thing of information here. But it's number of states that have approved legally taxing and regulating marijuana: 8. Alaska, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. Legal. It's now legal. They're not just decriminalized.
Right.
And the number of states that have decriminalized or removed the threat of jail time for simple possession of small amounts of marijuana is 22. I mean, that's not insignificant at all. And by the way, research suggests that cannabinoids might, mind you, but might reduce anxiety, reduce inflammation and relieve pain, control nausea and vomiting caused by chemotherapy, kill cancer cells and slow tumor growth. God, if there were ever something that we ought to be studying. Relax tight muscles in people with multiple sclerosis, stimulate appetite and improve weight gain in people with cancer and AIDS, and help decrease, and this is often overlooked, help decrease prescription opioid abuse and addiction.
That's the big one. I mean, that's the thing that's in the news right now is this huge opioid crisis, and well, there actually is something that's far less harmful.
So how big is the opioid crisis?
I'm
really curious. Is that something we have stats on, or
that that is one thing.
This could be a Summer of the Shark thing. I don't really know.
Because I was really fascinated to hear the stats about heroin and meth, because I never really put numbers on those things.
So without actually finding the stats, I will say that one of the things I listened to was the NPR debate on whether we should legalize drugs. And I didn't.
Oh, that'd be interesting. What did they come up with?
Well, of course, it was two guys versus two guys, and I mean, you have to make a decision on whose argument you find the most compelling. And
were there liberals that were arguing for or against? So because they've always, I feel like they've come down on both sides of it. Whereas conservatives have pretty much been anti.
I don't know how you would classify them ordinarily. I mean, there were two guys. There was a former. Gosh, was he former DEA? There was a former drug-related enforcement guy who was black and had and pointed out strongly and significantly that this was also very seriously a race issue. And
which side was he on?
Well, he was on the pro-legalization side.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and there was another guy who had the advantage of being quite funny, actually. But who was also eloquent and made some really good points about legalization. And then there were two guys on the other side who
sticks in the mud, kind of.
Well, I thought they did fine.
Yeah.
But a lot of the reason that they did fine was because the question was so vague. Do we legalize drugs? And they're like, well, we're really talking about should we legalize all drugs? And it's like, well, sure. As soon as you're throwing marijuana and mushrooms in with crack cocaine, you're going to be able to make a pretty compelling argument. At least for not legalizing it. Now, again, as I said, there's two different questions there: legalizing versus decriminalizing, and that's two very different things, of course. But and like I said, the legalization, there's some profit motive. I mean, we spent a lot on the war on drugs. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to still spend money if we legalize it, but we're going to be ideally spending it on different things, hopefully on things like therapy and education, which I would like to point out in all of my readings seemed to be the one thing that was consistent among any positive instances where decriminalization or legalization occurred seemingly worldwide. There was a lot of attention paid to educating people about the harm.
I was gonna say, did you get into Portugal and their recent kind of what I've read success? I haven't really dug into it.
That was covered. I did not dig into it. That was covered in the debate, though, the NPR debate. But I did dig fairly thoroughly into the Netherlands and their experience with it, and a little bit into Sweden. Actually, Sweden had a very interesting experience with this, and I wrote down I wrote down some stats on that too, and I don't remember actually where I put those dang stats on Sweden, but it was actually interesting because the stats with Sweden I thought were telling because it made you realize that you can't just jump in and assume that everything's going to be way better kind of willy-nilly if we just change the laws to make everything legal and let's let people kind of do what they want. We can sort of sort it out as we go because what happened, I can't find the data on that, but anyways, as I recall anyways, here we are. I found it. So between 1965 and 1967, non-medical drug users in Stockholm could obtain their favorite drugs, which could include stimulants as well as opiates, with a prescription from a handful of doctors who took part in a special program sanctioned by the National Board of Health. More than 4 million doses were prescribed for the initial 110 drug-addicted patients enrolled in the program. Out of those, about 3.4 million doses were stimulants. The remaining were primarily opiates. Unsurprisingly, a large percentage of these legally prescribed drugs were resold or given away.
This just reminds me of telling the doctor, I'm having problems with some addiction. Just rolling his eyes and be like,
okay,
nice try.
Resold or given away, flooding the city with drugs and spreading the drug epidemic in Sweden rather than limiting it as the program sponsors naively expected. This legal prescription experiment came to an abrupt end in June of 1967, 2 years after it started, following the tragic and widely publicized death of a 17-year-old girl who had been offered drugs by one of the patients in the prescription program. Official drug prevention policy at that time directed the police to concentrate on trafficking and smuggling and not on arresting the drug users for drug possession and street peddling. The presumption was that this would make it more attractive for them to voluntarily seek treatment and other help from social services providers or hospitals. During those years in Sweden, it was legal for drug users to possess up to 20 grams of hashish for personal use.
Nice.
Naturally, the street pushers never had more than this legal limit. Based on this newly articulated drug policy, the Swedish police changed its priorities to focus on small crimes of possession, making small-scale trafficking of drugs a much riskier business. Unsurprisingly, the number of drug crimes rose initially, while at the same time, drug use surveys showed a consistent decline all through the 1980s. And there were other parts to this that I thought were interesting, but I thought it was telling that they had, I think, the right idea, and at least they had good intentions where they didn't. And they were trying to say, well, look, there's a better way to do it than, let's say, with the American program of let's just lock all these, sons of bitches up in jail and call it a day, which is clearly not working and is outrageously expensive and destroys lives. Not just the lives of those in prison, which is significant. I think we looked at those stats already. But
and destroys human freedom.
It does, for sure. The
Fourth Amendment has been completely wrecked by the war on drugs.
Well, I think that it's worth pointing out, though, and I agree with you 100%. I really do. But it's worth pointing out, too, that I think if you're going to really talk about preserving liberty, you have to define what liberty is. And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I will say that I think that one consideration of the destruction of human liberty needs to be genuine concern for drug addiction, because I think drug addiction destroys human liberty. And I think that
that's true, but they also kind of, everyone at this point knows if I start taking heroin, I'm probably going to get addicted. So they're kind of responsible. Like, you have to own your own responsibility at some point.
I agree, but I think at the same time there are stats that seem to indicate that that if you legalize things, that its usage goes up. The easier you make it for people to acquire it, the more likely
there's more friction involved in acquiring. I get it.
Yeah, and so there, the question is there a sweet spot? And the answer is almost, as far with all my studying, the answer almost certainly seems to be yes. There's a sweet spot between legalizing something or at least decriminalizing it and making it difficult to get. I mean, even now
what if they just like tax the hell out of it? What if they?
Well, then the black market's still there and is there to serve. Like they still run that now in some states that they legalize marijuana and then tax shit out of it, and there's still underground marijuana pushers for half the price for the locals. I mean, they're mostly like Colorado's just picking off tourists left and right. And their taxes are pretty outrageous, but we don't really give a shit when we go up there.
But it's also unclear whether or not the effects of marijuana are actually bad, right? Like for something like heroin, I mean, you could definitely argue that some drugs, like if it's highly addictive and it is like somehow destructive to your health or, you know, whatever other metric you're kind of...
so we're not against scheduling per se, like just maybe, how it's been kind of worked out now.
Yeah. Well, you're suggesting that like having some friction there, like making it more difficult to obtain, does lower usage, and so
it does. And actually, just having it illegal lowers a good deal of usage.
But is it like, so? Once again, for marijuana, is it better to lower usage because they're going to use something, whether it's narcotics for pain or whatever, or alcohol because they can't handle their shit in life? I would say marijuana is the best choice.
Yeah. So especially since your question, there might be a question of, if people aren't going to be using marijuana, are they going to be using alcohol? And I think when you compare the two, especially if you can compare the two in terms of danger to others in society, and I've got some interest. I've got some stats on that that are super compelling. I mean, you want to talk about unambiguous stats? It is the safety stats comparing alcohol to marijuana.
It's unbelievable.
Is outrageous. Alcohol is a significantly more dangerous drug, especially to those around you, but also to yourself too, right? Yeah. Where'd my drink go?
Oh, you missed it.
There we go.
Yeah.
Talking about this has really worked up a thirst in me.
Everybody has your helmets on?
Mm-hmm. But so in terms of, you had talked about usage and legality. Yeah. You'd also asked about whether marijuana was even dangerous, and there is some evidence to suggest that maybe not that it's necessarily dangerous, but that there are some reasons to potentially not use it. Now, I would like to put a caveat in here that one of the things that I ran into consistently, and I've got stats on it somewhere in here, and I don't remember exactly where I put it right here. Oh shoot, I just scrolled down and I lost it. But I'll just say this much if I don't get back to it. The use of any kind of drug at all. The use of any kind of drug.
It's exciting.
Is exciting. Yeah. A high five for that. The use of any kind of drug at all before the brain has finished developing, and especially before you turn 18, is, drug use before 18 is outrageously predictive of drug abuse issues, or
Well, see, where did you get that from? Because Matt has been saying that about alcohol and 21 for a long time, and you look
I don't know about 21. I'm not going to say anything about 21.
Well, I'm genuinely curious because Matt's been kind of touting that stat about alcohol and 21 for a long time. And you look at all the European nations and they have lower rates of alcoholism than us and alcohol abuse. And like they're across the board better than us on all that stuff.
Yeah.
And they get to drink at 14 or 15 or 16. And it's a social deal and their parents teach them how to drink and all that.
Well, I don't mean to suggest either that, well, first of all, I think that everything needs to be put in some sort of societal context and family context, and there are tribes that use psychedelics, during puberty for all kinds of reasons. So I don't mean to suggest that. My point is that there's a trend, and I think that trend is probably exacerbated in our society for a number of different reasons. But the point is that if the brain is still developing, I think putting the studies aside for a second, because I did find some studies on that, and I wrote some of them down, and I've got a little bit here on it, but not having less to do with age in this particular one that I'm looking at. But and I imagined it to be self-evident, so I guess I should have put more down. But it seemed to me obvious that, look, if you're still if your brain is still developing and you're still learning how to cope, you break up with your first girlfriend and it's the end of the world. And I had experience with that where it was like I was 16, I broke up with my first girlfriend. And even to this day, I will remark that it is one of the sharpest pains I've ever felt in my life.
Sure.
So, and I mean, as a 16-year-old, I mean, this is ridiculous, right? And yet there it was, right? This is me learning how to cope with pain. And how did I cope with the pain? Well, I talked to a lot of friends and I went outside, I prayed, and I cried a lot. I cried a whole lot.
Sure.
And I felt sick to my stomach and I just all did all the normal stuff. Well, if you figure out that you can cope better with those kinds of feelings through substances, alcohol, marijuana, you name it, and you teach your brain, or rather you don't teach your brain how to cope with these things.
It's a bad road to go down doing fixing your problems with drugs. Sure.
Right. And you develop a kind of dependency, and your brain may very well wire itself to trigger that kind of, hey, you're feeling this way, I got the ticket.
I'd be in agreement with that, but I don't think that legality really plays that much role in availability. Like, I would like to see the link in that. Like, I remember in high school it was easier to get weed than alcohol, and alcohol was legal.
Yep.
And that's crazy. Like, that shouldn't... But that is the reality of the situation, or was. That should be taken into account. That seems to be just completely ignored by lawmakers.
Well, I think that...
they think that they wield like an iron fist and what they say goes, and actually, it really doesn't.
So I saw some stuff that indicated that availability of drugs was sort of a multivariable thing, and I didn't follow down that rabbit hole. Like I said, I had a limited amount of time, and I only followed down so many rabbit holes. But there was something that indicated that availability of drugs was something that tended to ebb and flow over time. Teen drug use, interestingly enough, even though drug use in America is actually on the incline, teen drug use is actually on the decline right now, strangely enough.
Interesting.
Yeah. I didn't go down that rabbit hole either, but I saw a number of references to that fact. And so one of the things that you talked about was sort of availability and legality. I don't think that's the only question, because there are a number of people, myself included, by the way. I did not drink till I was 21 as a question of policy, because had it been legal at 18, I would have done it at 18.
You're now, probably the only person that I know.
There's a limit. I don't think I'm the only person, because I suspect that there's still a number of people out. So I saw it as a kind of a Christian moral.
I think you're an asterisk to that. Yeah,
I might be, but I suspect that should we head, into the breadbasket, the Bible Belt, I suspect we might find more asterisks like me. Now, maybe not. But the point is that there is some evidence to indicate, and again, I don't know how many direct studies, but at least this has been suggested in the stuff that I've read, that when something is illegal, that as a matter of conscience, people will, there's at least a certain percentage of people that will not do it simply because it is illegal.
I hate that that's true.
Well,
yeah.
And
I think it's true.
It has some downsides, but it could have some upsides. Some of it might be sort of our German heritage too. We're sort of law followers, and to a certain extent, that can be a good thing. I mean, you want people waiting at traffic lights and not just speeding through red lights. You want people, there's societal benefits to following laws. There's all sorts of people
that have
not all laws are created equal.
There's also agreed.
I mean, many people, because of their profession, have to avoid. Like if you were a teacher or any sort of public servant or a doctor or maybe even to a lesser degree like a lawyer, but like a lot of these... You have to go in front
of a professional board or something.
Yeah, like almost all of these professions, I think you would have like a higher level aversion to breaking the law, right? Like even if it was a law you didn't believe in, like a drug law, for instance, because it could do like serious damage to your life. Like you're probably not worried if you smoke a joint that you're gonna jump off a building, but if you do get caught about it, you might get fired from your teaching job
and not being able to ever get hired again. Like
granted, you might get divorced. Like insane. It could be a serious consequence for you.
You can raise the risks significantly for professional people for breaking these laws. I get it. It just seems so insane with marijuana. Like, just so insane.
All right, so were you...
well, I got stats for days, man.
Stats for days, yeah.
If you guys...
I kind of had a couple of questions.
Let's pause it. I gotta go to the bathroom so bad.
Okay.
Well, go to the bathroom.
Or just keep going.
Why don't you go to the bathroom and we'll keep
the mic in there.
We'll keep it... You can hear from there.
If any of our listeners can diagnose this...
Yes.
Is this a normal sounding
He closed the door, so now he won't be able to hear anything we say. But
I'm kind of curious. I want to ask about. I kind of want to talk a little bit about maybe the subjective. That is really loud. The subjective kind of qualitative side of drugs a little bit. Like, I'm curious about like if people have. We mentioned hashish earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm actually curious about if people have like a really different high from smoking weed versus smoking hashish.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Calvin gets back, he might have an opinion on that.
Yeah, this is where we wish that more people had showed up for this podcast. And to Calvin's point, maybe we should have postponed this topic a week. And maybe we still can. Although we've covered so much, it would seem a bit. But we could cut it into two as well. And we could talk about that. But I think that we might as well cover that because we can recover that, and I think it'll still be interesting to talk about people's different experiences.
I'd be cool doing a part two.
Yeah.
I think another fun topic would be to talk about kind of like high profile or like famous drug users who have like attributed some of their success to their drug use. Like I'm thinking maybe David Bowie, and the cocaine Doors. Or probably several other drugs like Prince, like obviously entertainers. But even like the most prolific mathematician of all time was a famous amphetamine user. Steve Jobs was famously a proponent of LSD. I think that could be another interesting angle to discuss as like kind of the and people who've used drugs to do something great.
Oh, I agree. Well, let's move
Hunter
on to that.
S. Thompson, maybe.
Let's move on to that. Well, actually, so hold on. So there were some stats I overlooked that I thought were compelling that I kind of wanted to discuss really quickly in comparison to, we were talking about marijuana versus alcohol.
Oh yeah, I want to hear those alcohol stats. I'm sure they're horrifying.
Oh, it's I mean, it is unreal when you consider it. So first of all, from the CDC, this is from the CDC, 88,000 deaths a year from issues, acute and chronic, attributable to excessive alcohol use. The Department of Transportation, 10,265 people died in alcohol-impaired driving crashes, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all traffic-related deaths in the United States. Marijuana users were about 25% more likely to be involved in a crash than drivers with no evidence of marijuana use. However, other factors, such as age and gender, may account for the increased crash risk among marijuana users. I love that. The notion that they include gender as a possibility for increased risk of crashing a car.
So do insurance companies.
Oh, sure. They do. I mean, for sure. Yeah, if you're a boy, you're absolutely more likely to get into a car.
Well, I think that's a different rabbit hole, but
it is. And men, by the way, are also more likely to suffer from. I don't want to get this wrong because I didn't write it down. Men are more likely to either suffer from alcohol abuse or alcohol-related.
That's not that surprising.
Or become alcoholics. Or there was some alcohol abuse issues there that were gender-related. Yeah. Well, so let me finish these, and then I'll let you.
Yeah.
Sorry. 2 studies on Colorado indicated that traffic accidents may have increased by about 3% since pot legalization, but fatal crashes remained unchanged. Which you can, by the way,
that sounds about right.
I have, and there is also a stat, by the way, that there are more stoned users on the road now than ever before, which would be troubling, except for the fact that if you've ever driven stoned, which I've only done once.
It was whatever the statute of limitations plus 1 day ago.
No, it was shockingly recent. It was tragically recent, and it was a very short distance. And I was driving, and I remember.
Be sure to edit this out because you don't want to get this.
It's too late. I'm not going to edit it out, and you know what? They can come for me. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The whole point of this is to spread awareness. So let's do it. Let's go for it. I don't mind being.
It was in Mexico.
It was totally in Mexico.
All right.
But I was driving, and I was driving away from the Alamo Draft House
in Mexico City.
Mexico City,
where we usually go.
Where we always go to see a movie on a Friday night. Last Friday night.
I swear to God, it was Mexico.
And yeah, I mean, it was interesting because the things that you expect to have happen, kind of happened. Where it was like I'm like a little bit concerned, like, oh God, I need to make sure that I'm being safe. let me make sure I'm not speeding. And you look down and you're like, oh, I'm
doing 20 miles an hour.
I'm doing 20 miles an hour under the speed limit. Like, this is, it was all sort of the typical stuff. Now, it's worth pointing out that there are some of the things, and I mentioned this in the stats, that some of the things that are not taken into account when you talk about the risks of marijuana usage, which are much more complicated than alcohol, by the way. That one of the things that they haven't done enough studies to take into account, and part of the reason, of course, is because it's difficult to do studies on a Schedule I drug, is that there's other variables in play. So what is more likely to distract you if you're in a car and you're drunk versus if you're in a car and you're stoned? Well, these are things that they haven't taken into consideration. What if there's a lot of bright lights? What if it's daytime versus nighttime? Like, are vision impairments considered? Are sound impairments considered? I mean, there's a lot of factors that actually go into it. You don't really think about it, but there's a lot of factors. So, it's okay. So, and then I write exactly right here. It's difficult to measure impairment with marijuana and psychedelics because they are more complicated in their effects than alcohol on the human body. But a study by Federal Highway and Traffic Safety Administration concluded that an increased risk of crashing on marijuana is virtually negligible, but other studies indicate that it's not that simple. And in at least one case, the risk of an accident on cannabis was double the risk when sober. Again, complications in the type of impairments make it more complicated, not to mention the difficulty of performing studies when cannabis is still a Schedule I drug. However, on painkillers and sedatives, the risk of crash is higher. And on stimulants and antidepressants, your risk of crashing is lower than if you are sober. And
let's get that cocaine moved off that schedule too.
And on alcohol, it is astronomically, indeed absurdly higher.
Yeah.
Absurdly. And when I look at this graph, I wish I could show this graph right now to the listeners. When you look at the graph, everything just looks like minuscule and irrelevant compared to the alcohol part of the graph, which was almost 600% increased chance, and there were other studies that indicated different numbers, but this one was almost 600% higher. You were almost 600% more likely to get into a crash with alcohol. And when you look at the other drugs that they studied, they were negligible. They were negligible, even the ones where you were greater, which were painkillers and sedatives. Which you would think, I mean, they even say, like, do not operate machinery. Now, don't get me wrong, it's illegal to drink and drive, and it should be. And I kind of wonder, given
that's another part.
well, I kind of think that, in fact, is it possible that if you legalize marijuana, is it possible that people will choose to use marijuana and not use alcohol, or at least use alcohol to a significantly lesser extent, and that the people who are just going to drive home anyways,
the alcohol
company, I would much rather that they be on pot than that they be on alcohol, and maybe drunk driving incidents or drunk driving even just occurrences, because vast minority of these people get caught, would be significantly lower if pot were an option. And I would like to reference that time that you and I went out one time, and I took half an edible in Mexico when I was going to the Alamo Draft House last Thursday. And I did it as a substitute for alcohol. And to be honest, I was worried about the toxicity of alcohol. I was kind of concerned about my liver. I was concerned about the fact that I was drinking a little more often, frequently. And I never drink or drive. No. I drink and drive, excuse me.
I never drink or drive anywhere. They're both evil as fuck. I'm out.
I never drink and drive these days. And I'm part of the reason I like living downtown in Mexico City.
Right.
Is because I really like the proximity. I can just take a Lyft anywhere. But anyways, the point is that I took half an edible, and I only took about 2 drinks, and man, I felt great. Inhibitions were lower. I was having fun. I had more energy. I was more sociable, and I didn't drive home anyways.
Well, the alcohol companies are lobbying against legalization left and right. They're fighting as hard as they can for a reason. They see this coming. Like, alcohol sales in Colorado, and this is pretty soon after it was done, so I don't know if there's been any studies since, but there was a dramatic drop in alcohol sales right when they legalized it. And they could have leveled out or come back a little bit as kind of the, newness of it kind of wore off. But they realize it's competition, and they don't like it.
Yeah.
For a reason.
Well, and it is. Nobody gets super stoned and is like, oh, great, let me go out and get... Well, I don't want to say nobody, because I'll be damned if there's a lot of people out there that do crazy.
We don't have
crazy,
to refer
crazy
to every outlier. You can make generalizations.
I'm going to make a generalization and say that very few people go out and get super stoned and they're like, what's next? Let's get super drunk as well.
Yeah.
Like that, that
doesn't really happen.
No, it doesn't. And in fact, I am looking forward to, in theory, going to Mexico City and taking a lot more edibles and drinking a lot less alcohol. And I think my body, quite frankly, will thank me. And in fact, even more than that, I'm excited about the prospect of exploring, instead of even just going out at all, taking, at least maybe once or twice a month, taking some psychedelics. And this might be a good segue into what you were talking about, David, taking some psychedelics and really sort of exploring my mind, my ego, the world and reality, etc. And I'll be damned if there's not a slew of evidence. If you sort of wanted to kind of talk into people's experience, and you wanted to talk about maybe marijuana and hashish, and we could talk about that too. But there is so much. There was a guy, by the way, who talked about mushrooms. Now, mushrooms grow on cow shit.
There's a lot of different psychedelic mushrooms out there, or psilocybin mushrooms out there, but the main one that I think that Americans get in illicit trade is going to be your shit shrooms.
Yes, and it's so an interesting thing, by the way. So first of all, history is there. We could do a whole nother podcast, and indeed, people have already done podcasts about this, the history of man, the doubling of the brain size over 2 million years, and the role that psychedelics might have played. It's a great theory. The theory that psychedelics may have been instrumental in developing human consciousness and creativity, and even spirituality, etc.
How else do you explain the Book of Revelation, John?
Fair enough. Well, and then there's the guy who studied the Dead Sea Scrolls, who was the only non-Christian to really be on this panel, who came out and was like, oh yeah, the history of Christianity has been completely confused. It is a history, in fact, of mushroom use. It's like all about mushrooms. It's all about drugs.
That'd be interesting to dig into.
Yeah, I haven't dived into that at all. But in any case, there's a guy who apparently thinks that Christianity is totally being.
I love wild theories like that. I want to look into
this. Sounds like a troll without any sort of.
No, this is legit. This is the legit. Oh. This guy, I can tell you for certain that this guy exists. And that this guy actually, he wrote a whole book on it. And the book went out of print for a while, and somebody picked it up and put it back in print. Now, but in any case, there is the thing is we have very little proof, and depending on whom you ask, there may be no proof, but in fact, there is some proof, depending on what you count as proof, that there was hallucinogenic, specifically mushroom usage in prehistory.
Oh, without a doubt.
Well, it's not necessarily without a doubt. There are some people who doubt it because there is little evidence to point to.
How is there evidence against? Oh.
Well, I will say this. That one of the most compelling arguments that I heard made was that without evidence was that it's like, look, these people are foragers. These people go around and they literally look for food, and they're constantly testing things out to find out if they're poisonous. If they're not, they're constantly looking for edible mushrooms, and they determine which mushrooms are edible and which ones aren't. And the ones that are, they eat them. And whatever is edible, whatever berries are edible, they've got it. They're foragers. They go through, and this is what they do for their entire life is basically based on, they're hungry. They go around and they find out what they can eat. Well, so of course these things, psilocybin mushrooms are rampant. They're all over the place. And so of course the notion that these foragers somehow shunned these psychedelic mushrooms despite their forager status is incredibly unlikely, and that in all likelihood they did in fact start eating these, and that they probably.
I thought this was the argument that we never mess with them.
No, this is the inverse argument.
Okay.
Sorry, I might.
So in other words, they just need. So you're saying that they needed to eat them to stay alive, and so they just like.
My point is that they
would have gotten to them eventually at a process.
My point is that they would have discovered them, and they would have loved them, and they would have continued to eat them, and that the brain. So the brain does interesting things on psilocybin, by the way, and there are paths that crisscross. I mean, they've done studies where they actually watch the brain activity that takes place, and there are paths that sort of light up, so to speak, right, quote unquote, and and they're paths that normally do not interact. They're parts of the brain that normally are not communicating with each other that begin communicating with each other. And you end up with instances of what's called synesthesia, which you guys probably are familiar with. It's the blending of senses. And you can do things like taste colors and hear, colors. Or I don't know. You know what I mean? You end up with senses that...
Your senses are overwhelmed.
Yes. Yeah. Well, they're not just overwhelmed. They're crisscrossing.
Yeah.
So you may hear a voice and you might see that voice, right? Or you might see a color and you might see the sound, or you might even see numbers, but like you get a color sensation with it, right? Or something like that, like little like weird things about it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that synesthesia is not unique to drugs. Synesthesia is also something that occurs in certain genetic predispositions. There's a genetic predisposition in humans. Some people are genetically designed to have or suffer from or be enlightened by, depending on how you want to look at it, synesthesia. And so, so that's an interesting idea that that reality indeed, by the way, is probably not what we think it is. And in large part, you can show evidence of that. There's quite a natural thing that if you're genetically experiencing synesthesia, then you are naturally experiencing the world in a very, very, very different way. Now, Aldous Huxley, whom we have read recently for book club, we have a classics book club, and Aldous Huxley, one of our next readings by far is going to be Doors of Perception, from which the Doors got their name. By the way, the band The Doors got their name from Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley, of course, famously took a ton of psychedelic drugs. I think it was, I want to say maybe it was MDMA. I don't remember what he was taking, actually.
I don't think MDMA came out until late 70s. It was finally synthesized. I think it was actually Austin, Texas is kind of the birthplace of it, and it was big into it was big in the club scene forever. Clubs would have MDMA nights, and they called it something else, but it was a huge club scene drug, and it was totally legal, and people were just going wild on it. And finally, the feds were like, "Oh, we can't have this much fun. Like, we got to shut this down."
I really would like to know what it was like to be in Austin in the 70s. I mean, this place is going so fast. There's so many people. And it's so different now. Can you imagine what Austin was like with 200,000 people? That would be bizarre, especially if they're all whacked out on drugs.
No traffic. Yeah, it'd be amazing.
No traffic. There's parking everywhere.
It'd be amazing.
That's a weird side note. But anyways, the point is that so the idea is that he thought that the brain essentially, and this isn't a huge stretch, right? It's not like this crazy theory about aliens. The idea was that the brain, and we know this to be true to a certain extent anyways with the eyeball and the amount of input that the eyeball takes in and the way it interprets it, that the brain actually shortcuts a lot of these things and kind of goes, yeah, I get it. It's this. Yeah. And so you end up seeing a lot of optical illusions, right? And you end up quote unquote seeing a lot of things that you are actually not seeing. And your brain thinks it sees it, but in fact it
fills in the gaps,
precisely, right? So
anecdotally, I think having taken some of those drugs, the way I experienced in Mexico, never. The way it felt to me was that, on LSD, like having one way that I can kind of describe the experience that I had was being able to feel these kind of like grooves that your thoughts usually follow, like almost like there's like paths that they flow, and there's kind of like boundaries that are on either sides of them. And then when you're tripping, you can essentially those boundaries kind of
disappear a little bit.
Yeah, they kind of are less like you can kind of see. It's like your brain can feel beyond them, like rather than just like blindly automatically going through them.
Right.
It's like your brain kind of goes to places which are kind of like lateral from like the normal path.
Do you feel like you always get kind of some kind of like moral, I don't know, enlightened like thought or something that like applies to you personally? Because I've gotten that before in Mexico when I've done it, where it's always something just kind of like random, but it's something that, or it feels random at the time, but then I'll sit there and think about it for a few days or weeks, and it's something that is pretty applicable to kind of where I'm at in my life, and I can totally understand where, the shamans have been into this stuff for different societies for centuries or eons or whatever. But yeah, have you ever had, I don't know, just like epiphanies?
Yes, certainly. I think there's kind of two large experience or like phenomenon that could
kind of
fit with what you were saying. And one is that I think that you kind of just get an outside perspective, and a lot of times you can almost visualize ideas spatially. It's like it's kind of like a different part of your mind unlocks, and like so you can kind of like see perspectives that you couldn't see otherwise. And then I think so there's another interesting experience that I had one time. I think I was taking like 2CB.
What's that?
2CB is one of the I don't know how to describe it chemically, but it's like it's kind of in the same family. It's kind of it's similar to acid.
Okay, I would synthetic psilocybin kind of deal.
Yeah. And actually, I really want if we had like a drug book club, I really would like to read.
Dude, I'm totally in.
Like, do you guys know about Alexander Shulgin, who's he's like a famous chemist who wrote a lot about his drug experiences.
No,
I don't know about this either.
But yeah, I'd love to read one of his books. But I think that he wrote a lot about these the kind of synthetics, and I forget how to refer to them chemically, but yeah, like 2CB, 2CE.
And that's different than acid, though. Like in the
yeah,
is it more powerful, less powerful?
No, I mean I don't really know. I almost want to look this up because I feel like off the top of my head I couldn't tell you.
There's a really good podcast on acid, on stuff you should know. You ever listen to that podcast?
No,
it's pretty good. And they dig into it, and yeah, there was something that I didn't realize that basically the whole flashback thing, at least the conclusion they came to digging into it for a while, was that it's all government propaganda. Like, no one has actually ever had a flashback from LSD.
I've never had one. I've never had anything remotely like that.
Yeah.
That's conclusive.
Yep, I'm convinced.
So to go, so to finish the thought, the second experience I had that could lend itself to kind of like having a revelation, epiphany. So I was on, I think it was 2CB, and you can think of it, it's pretty similar to one of the other hallucinogens, like acid or ecstasy. But I was down at Barton Springs, like at the free part.
Oh, what a great way! In Mexico.
In Mexico, yeah, exactly. And I've had this kind of aversion to cold water my entire life. Like when I get
really?
And water in general, but like if I just step into it or something, like I feel like this really strong kind of, it's like an emotional, like a fear. I don't know if you describe it as a phobia. Okay. But it's like I feel a sensation, and it just is like it's very uncomfortable and makes me want to like leave. Like you can imagine, other like really psychologically or emotionally uncomfortable things that just make you want to make it stop. Yeah. And like, I mean, maybe you can, I think everybody has that to some degree. If you get in really cold water, it's like, it's
scary.
Difficult.
I always just have to jump in.
It doesn't hurt, but it's almost like, it's very similar to pain in that it makes you want to like just get away from it, right? Like it's uncomfortable. But one thing I noticed is that when I was on 2CB, but I think I think I had like a very strong feeling that would like prevent me from like getting into water. When I was on 2CB, I was like kind of wading across, like just like wading into the free part. I don't know, the crossing.
I think they call it Barton Springs, like the dog.
Yeah, or the dog
springs or something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, and as you know, Barton Springs is quite chilly.
It's exactly 69 degrees year round or something, 68, whatever. Yeah.
Which doesn't sound that cold, but it feels really. I mean, that's with water. That's cold enough to. Yeah. And so, but I remember while I was on this drug, like I felt that sensation, but it wasn't connected to
fear or anything like that.
It wasn't. Well, it's like I could feel the sensation in my body, and I could feel the other thing, like the fear, but the fear wasn't like connected to my
conscious mind.
So like the part of the mind that would like lead me to do something. And so it was like I could feel it there, and I could feel that it was an uncomfortable feeling, but there was no, like it had no power to like
you could compartmentalize it, and it was like you're not going to react to it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. So that it was there, but I didn't feel like any, like there was no, like it wasn't difficult to be there with it at all. Like it was just there.
Did you feel like you were just kind of standing over, like looking at it, but it didn't really, it just wasn't connected kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Like it wasn't connected to the part of my self that would like precipitate some like sort of action. Yeah. Right. So, but then once you can kind of be with it, it starts to actually like loosen up a little bit. And so, so what was interesting to me about that is like that we, I think we probably all heard at this point that, they've had some progress, using ecstasy to treat,
PTSD.
Yeah. And like
I actually talked to a girl in Aspen that had experienced that. That's pretty wild.
Yeah. And so I wonder if that made me think that there's like, perhaps there's, there can be like something in your mind that's like too painful to deal with, or that you can't, or that you kind of, whenever you touch it, it kind of like takes control of you. And so you can never really like
deal with it
or like, or move beyond, or like, or I don't want to say move beyond it, but, and I actually think that like after that experience, like I actually think that my, without ever like trying to consciously work on it or anything, like I think that like my kind of phobia, if you want to call it like that, was lessened,
dissipated. Nice.
Yeah, and I wasn't even focusing on trying to do it, but
that's so cool.
Anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting story. It kind of plays into what you were asking about. Like, have you ever had a revolution?
Absolutely.
And it's a little bit less like, it's not like a religious experience. It's not like it changed my, but these drugs, I would like, I think one takeaway from having done them is that they're not as like one-dimensional as you might think that they are. It's not like and I feel like some of the more common drugs are a little bit like caffeine or alcohol or something are a little bit more one or two dimensional, whereas like
there's a lot of room to explore these things.
Yeah,
for sure. I had one in Colorado, Mexico that I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, I've always had, every time I've done mushrooms, which is, I don't know, 5 or 6 probably, I've always gotten a little bit of, I feel like I carried something away from it, some kind of moral from it. But this last one was really interesting, and probably, but it was, oddly enough, probably the least dosage that I was on. But I remember I was at this like electronic music festival and had, taken some mushrooms or whatever, and was walking around. And I was just like, I had a pocket full of cash, and I was just gripping it super tightly as like the mushrooms are kind of building up. And all of a sudden, it's like my own voice told me like, "Hey, pay attention to what you're doing right now." And I just had this like death grip on money, and I'm like, "Oh, man, you're kind of right. Like this sounds like such a super stoner thing to say, but it's like I might care a little bit too much about money and wealth and all that, and it's probably a good thing to let go of a little bit to grow as a human." And it took me a couple weeks to kind of think about that and unpack that. And I'm not, I haven't totally, heeded its advice or whatever, but it, I don't know. I think that there's a reason that ancient cultures have done this stuff. I mean, it's probably done a lot more good than harm, but you only hear about the harm when a 16-year-old in Amsterdam throws himself off a roof. It's like, well, that sucks. But if they'd been drunk and done it, like they wouldn't ban alcohol. And that's totally insane. They're like, everyone's just waiting for like one bad thing to happen until one of these like psychedelic drugs just gets totally banned if it's not already.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, I was going to say that's a really interesting point, because I mean, if you look at these numbers about the percentage of people that have done some of the like psychedelic drugs, I mean, were they 10% or 20%, 20% or something for the lifetime?
Tried it. Yeah, it was low.
I mean, 20% still seems high to me.
It's only 13%.
13%. So it's interesting to think about, well, like, can you expect society at large to like have an accurate? Because I think everybody's done alcohol. Like even if you're or
80%.
Or like what 80% of people.
How many Mormons are in this country?
But yeah, like I think a lot of people, even if they don't drink alcohol or like mostly have never done it, they at least like know about it. They probably have a friend. Like,
right.
They're probably not totally
in the dark.
And it's also like a little bit easier to understand. I feel a little bit more culturally mainstream. And so I think that there's definitely a fear associated with like the unknown that might be like, okay, someone does mushrooms and like jumps off a building, where if like only 13% of someone has even ever done a psychedelic.
Well, probably half the people that have done psychedelics did it in party settings where they freak themselves out and they're like, oh yeah, ban that shit. No one needs to do it.
Yeah,
it's like, all right, everyone calm down. Like, that's not what it's meant for. That's not why it's here.
Like, and I think we have a tendency, of course, to focus in on the bad without paying attention to the good. And there's so many stories, and that's what I sort of realized is that as I listened to doctor after doctor and read study after study and heard story after story and quote after quote of people who had these transcendent experiences, eye-opening experiences, things like what you're talking about, life-changing experiences. Hey, think about what you're doing right now. Think about what this means for you and your life, and think about, so many people talk about how in their experiences on psychedelics, hey, how are you affecting other people right now? Think about your behavior toward others right now. What, you know what I mean? How are you potentially ruining the lives of these people or those people? You talked about the multidimensional experience of psychedelics, and I think that there was something to that here, where I think, if you're drinking alcohol, you are a different version of yourself. Whereas people who take, and I've never taken ayahuasca, but the people that I have talked to who've taken it, or people I've only talked to a couple, but in most instances, it's been me reading about these studies or reading people taking it or listening to Joe Rogan podcasts about it. And, there's this notion that, man, I am not in control anymore. Something else is in control. And I think for a lot of people, that's a scary notion. But in fact, this being that's in control is seemingly 99 times out of 100 there to really help you and really help you grow and make you think and to get away from your ego. And to question, the assumptions that you've made that might be bad. I mean, there's so many positives that come from this, and it's not just this, but it also makes you actually. I mean, it talks about the antidepressant qualities. You talked a little bit about that.
Oh, especially like end of life stuff. They figured out that the psilocybin is working wonders for people with terminal cancer, like to accept kind of their fate and not be so depressed or sad about it, which is unfathomably like worthwhile. I mean, it's crazy. The stuff, the studies are coming out on this stuff, and we're still just dragging our feet like, nah, you're still a dirty hippie, go to jail. And I'm like, oh my god,
it is amazing. It is. If there were any other object coming up with these kinds of results, with these kinds of numbers, it would be a miracle drug. And in fact, go figure, it is actually a miracle drug. It actually is a miracle. Yeah. It is a miracle drug, and it's just
it should be respected. Like, it's not something you just eat the hell out of and then go like party like crazy. That's where it probably gets a kind of a bad reputation, is people freaking out, and that does happen. But that's personal responsibility. You don't know what you're getting into. Dip your toes in. Be an adult. Figure it out. Take responsibility for your own life. Yeah,
I agree. And I don't, the one area where I didn't study was on recreational use to that extent, right? Like if we consider spiritual growth or introspection use for that purpose, or for treatment of PTSD or treatment of depression, etc., I didn't think of that as recreational use, obviously. But in instances where people take it and go party, I didn't really study that much, to be completely honest. So I can't even weigh in and just say, it would be irresponsible for me to say, I agree with you, it should be taken responsibly. I'm not 100% sure necessarily that it is wrong to just go out and do it willy-nilly.
I'm not saying wrong. I'm saying that there's definitely settings that are more likely to trigger really bad trips.
That's fair.
And in college, I saw people just, like two, just absolutely freaking out. But they were at college parties, loud music, going crazy, and they probably took an insane dose and whatever. And they just freaked out and had to be, put in a corner in a closet or whatever.
Yeah, you need to respect the power of it. Yeah. For sure. But I think if you...
But then those stories, like if the cops get called, somebody's going crazy, like that's what hits the county news and everyone goes crazy about that. And it's like, well, what about the 200 other people that night that took it and had an awesome time, that had some self-discovery and whatever?
Yeah. No. I agree. And I think, and actually that's another thing that I have a slew of stats on, is all the positive benefits of psilocybin and... Oh yeah.
Let's do it.
Tons of stuff. Yeah. So the most, we talked about a lot of this stuff, treating depression, treating PTSD. That's right. One of the interesting things, and they've got some great studies that they did. And in instances where there were PTSD victims where no other drugs were effective, when they were actually given MDMA, combined with psychotherapy, 83% in instances where no other drugs worked, 83% no longer showed PTSD symptoms, combined with 25% of those who were given just psychotherapy. I mean, these are numbers.
They're astronomical. It's mind-blowing.
That ought to be turning heads. There were two guys, Roland Griffiths at Hopkins and Steve Ross at NYU. They did a couple of studies showing that a single exposure to psilocybin induced powerful antidepressant responses that lasted for 6 months or longer. Ross followed up with many of them. In this case, they were cancer patients experiencing depression. He discovered that many of them, up to 2 years later, were still undepressed. I mean, that's nuts. So the NYU team, by the way, says that between 60 and 80% of its participants had similarly reduced anxiety and depression 6.5 months after the single psychedelic trip. Nick Fernandez, a 2014 participant in the NYU study, says his trip took him on an emotional journey that helped him see, quote, a force greater than himself. Quote, something inside me snapped, and I realized all of my anxieties, defenses, and insecurities weren't something to worry about.
Right. So here's the big question. Why does none of this affect policy? Seriously. Why?
I think there is. When I talk, I'm going to go back to my initial point.
Especially MDMA and therapy. That's wild.
I'm going to go back to my initial point. I really think when I talked to my mom and my dad about psychedelics, the second I even said that I took psychedelics, you could see they tensed up. They tensed up noticeably. Knee-jerk reaction.
That's got to be just from government programming from their whole lives.
Well, societal programming, not even just government programming. I think societal
John, I'm trying to throw the government on the bus. You don't have to regulate.
I'm happy to throw the government under the bus.
Why? But the thing is, it's not even an issue. It's not something you hear about. It's not like it doesn't even make like the political top 20. So our next podcast, or one of the next few, should be who controls the media and what gets reported on and what gets bumped up to the top and what's talked about and whatnot. Because it's crazy that the stuff that actually affects people like this. Why do people listen to the media? Would be a better question. I mean, if everybody would just tune out.
I think entertainment I don't think most people want to actually admit that it's entertainment on why you watch the news. But there's basically two sides. There's more than two sides, but there's two sides that actually kind of matter, and they're just fighting the hell out of each other. It's
calling it entertainment is really a euphemism, or because the people, or my definition of entertainment would be something that you offers short-term enjoyment or stress relief.
I think it's watching a football game. News, you have your team.
I feel like people get angry when they watch the news. They get outraged. It's something I understand that you would classify it as entertainment when you're talking about the business that they're doing,
sure.
the industry. But calling the reason, saying that people do that to be entertained is kind of it just seems like a very perverse form of entertainment. Perverse,
but I think it's real, and I think that when people get angry, they're not getting angry at something random. Their anger is at the thing that they already. There's a bit of a confirmation. I don't want to say confirmation bias, but there's a little bit of that.
Absolutely, everybody is. Yeah.
Where you're getting angry at the other side. You're getting angry at this sort of invisible enemy or whatever it is, or very real enemy in some instances, and your vindication. The anger is a form of sort of vindication. Look at what the other side has done, and it is vindicating my beliefs, the things that I think are true, and that probably is kicking off some sort of reward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and we have
brain.
Different channels for whatever you act whatever team you're on that can, vindicate whatever your thoughts are.
Yeah, movies make you angry. Movies make you sad. Why do we go watch movies that make us cry? Well, that's not. How is that entertainment? Well, it is entertainment. It's entertainment because you don't have to just leave a movie smiling to be entertained.
Yeah.
It's also pretty addictive. So you get involved with the narrative, whether it's Trump impeachment or whatever the story of the day is, and you get hooked on. So CNN just is talking about that every single day. Fox News is talking about whatever they're talking about every single day, and they're different stories of the same show, and people get hooked on their side. Like they're just, man, this is so far off topic.
It is, but I'll bring it back. No, it's fine. I'll bring it back because I'll point out that the reason this doesn't end up on the news is because there's nothing but good news about it. There's nothing to get mad at.
Well, I'm mad.
But see, this is
that's really
interesting. But why? But like, and
I
feel like this is
a
subject for another podcast. But it's like, why? Yeah, when we have something like this where the numbers are so, like, when you really look at the data and you like look at alcohol and you're like, okay, this is horrible, and you look at ecstasy and you're like, this is a miracle drug, and then like we don't talk about it. Like you don't hear, like, you're like, why is policy different?
Policy?
Well, the question is like,
changed?
why do we talk about things that are just
don't affect
bullshit? Yes, or like so many of the things don't matter.
Here's where, and
I don't have an answer for that.
I really don't want to go off on this because this is a whole other podcast.
But this is a segue.
This is a whole other podcast that we will have.
Yeah.
But I'll say that I disagree with you guys on this one because I really think that the news. I don't think that the media is. I almost don't even want to say it because it's going to start this thing. We're going to go off on the wrong podcast. But the point is that I really think that the media, they go with what drives the numbers. They're trying to get listeners, and at the end of the day, the more listeners they get, they're going to go put up whatever really drives viewership. And I think at the end of the day, they're following us. We're not following them. And I think the things, and that's why new media is getting more and more sensational.
New scandals that are there or not there, or whatever. Like Summer the Shark and all that
it's
bullshit.
full sensation.
I'd be curious to know about like what their internal models are about that. Like for instance, if you're some, I don't know what the right role is, right? But you're a manager at one of the major news.
Whatever.
Like how, like what is your mental model about how news should be, and like what is your theory behind that?
I bet they won't tell you.
Is it? Yeah, I bet they won't. But is it like you described? Because I think that a lot of evidence points that way. But like part of me wants to be like, well, what is the real?
They're without a doubt interconnected
story
with political parties too. Like
definitely, yeah.
I mean, all the WikiLeaks emails showed that CNN and the DNC were holding hands the whole way. Like that. That's not even debatable. I mean, it's crazy, but it's true. Like.
I'm bringing it back around.
I know, we're like getting so off.
I'm short-circuiting
You can edit this later, John.
Yeah, I'm going to short-circuit it. I'm not even going to edit it. I'm just going to short-circuit it. This is basically your teaser. This is your teaser for your next podcast.
The next one.
I'm going to bring it back around, though, and I'm going to point out, you want to talk about a little newsworthy bit. In 2013, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs released a study that covered suicides from 1999 to 2010, which showed that roughly 22 veterans were dying by suicide per day, or one every 65 minutes. And some sources suggest that the rate may be undercounting suicides. Now, when you take into consideration the fact that
veterans that aren't in the VA system, I'm sure
that the people who were taking psilocybin or MDMA were having experiences that were seriously reversing depression-like symptoms. How do you not just say, well, hell, if 22 veterans, mind you, are offing themselves every damn day, how do you not go, screw it? I don't care if this is PC. I don't care if this is okay or not. Yeah. We're going to put them on this shit, and we're going to save some lives.
It's got to be Republicans holding this shit up.
Where's the leadership? Yeah, like why isn't someone standing up and being like, hey, let's...
Well, apparently it's political suicide. I mean, I guess the question is, are people like our parents going to vote them out of office if they stand up and go, by the way, let's give all our veterans psychedelics? I mean, these are people who, by the way, grew
far
up
too
through.
Scared. Yeah, I mean, they're probably, like, the politicians are scared that would happen. I don't think that would happen. If they presented it, well, it's hard to present anything without getting just doing like 4-second sound bites that the news can kind of piece together. But
the baby boomers vote. They vote, and there's a lot of them. And I'll tell you if... It's going to not be that long before we really dominate in the voting arena. But the baby boomers, God bless them, and I love them, but they gotta die already because they're really holding up progress. And
in a lot of areas, but yeah, in a lot of areas they are.
I don't mean to. I mean, listen, you want to throw the governor under the bus? I want to throw my parents under the bus. On this. No, I love my parents, and my parents are, and God bless them. They're thinkers. They're smart people. They really are. But there's But I dare say, man, there's a lot of baby boomers.
Well, I think it'd be
dead
interesting
set in their
if you actually present, like, this evidence is not actually presented to people almost ever. It's not reported on the news.
True.
Because nobody wants it. I don't know why nobody wants it, but nobody gives a shit. And it should be dealt with. Now, there's a lot of different explanations, and you can think about like why that might be and why it's not reported, and why like nobody gives a shit. But that's the reality.
Well, that's
an interesting question. Is like, how could we? Like, there's an interesting kind of philosophical question here. Is like, so here's an example of something where we could like really easily make the world a much better place, right? Like, it's like, okay, we have lots of people who have like serious mental
trauma,
difficulty. That can be. We know a great answer for it. Why can't we make it happen, right? And like, why can't we care about it? And I agree with you that it doesn't make really enthralling news. Like, people, like they might, they run that on the media and everybody's like, who gives a shit?
Right. But you could make a really positive impact on the world. Yeah, for sure.
So, but how could people like think differently to make it so that we could prioritize something like this? Like, can you imagine a way that where we could, like, a world in which it would be different, where like we could kind of like, people would maybe like
a strategy to make them actually hear this message? Because
this is such an obvious. This isn't pie in the sky. Like, this is so accessible. It's so easy.
I've
it's
talked
just a
to people
matter
that have said this was like 10 years of therapy in a weekend of taking this stuff and getting over PTSD. Like, it's without a doubt works. Why there's such a stigma against it? I mean, I think it's just people admitting that they might have been wrong about something. Plus, drugs are bad and whatever.
Well, has there been any legislation induced, or like, I'm trying to think like who actually has the power to do this? I mean,
Congress, without a doubt, has all the power. The DEA could move these things. So the DEA could reschedule drugs to allow for more study. Right now, you have to have like very localized, scrutinized studies on all this stuff for it to be legal. There are practitioners that are doing it illegally, and they have their licenses at risk, and so it's like they're actually really heroes in this whole game for doing that. But the psychiatrists that are prescribed or that are going to these sessions with MDMA that don't have approval to do it, and there are a number of them in the U.S. that are doing it. And they're putting their whole lives on the line to do this because it actually helps people. And it's such a shame that they have to do that. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, are there any members of Congress who've been like pushing this, or like is it an issue?
None.
Like, I don't really follow these things that much.
The problem is you don't get to Congress if you've been whacking your brain out on psychedelics. So you got to kind of. Well, I say that, but that's not true. That's really not true. There's a lot of.
Well, you would think that like at least on the left, you would have a lot of people who would be open. Like, I just don't know. You've
got 13% of the population taking this stuff, and everybody else is probably shaking in their boots when they hear the word. Yeah, but I don't think it's a safe bet for politicians.
But culturally, I bet. I just think that people who are more liberal, like, probably are more open to it. Like, I bet.
Where's the message come from? How do you get it to people?
News stations don't give a shit.
No, yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine a world in which we could think in a way that would allow us to like do something that's like
you're trying to be constructive.
When you put the facts here, it's like obvious to me that this is the right thing to do. Like, make this. You have a treatment that works incredibly well. Like, you're talking about 80% of people recovering or have some substantial progress. It's like it's kind of like well known in the fact that these.
Well, I think this is kind of proof that government usually doesn't really give a shit about what actually works for people or what works in the real world.
Or a better way to put it is that they care more about what drives votes. I mean, scientists could come out and all say, listen, guys, this is working. And they probably have had people come into Congress and basically talk about these things. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the fact that people get on Joe Rogan all the time and talk about these things is reaching people. I wouldn't be surprised.
I think it is. You're definitely seeing a change.
There's a slow burn here. But I mean, at the same time, it's a tall order to ask people to really, I think, experience this and understand it. You have to be touched by some sort of problem that is solved by psychedelics, or you have to have just tried psychedelics. Well, you're talking about a pretty limited percentage of the population there, and it's a big leap to go from the sort of conservative, standpoints that we have. I'm not trying to say that it's not possible. That's not my point. But I don't have an answer. I don't have the answer.
It also doesn't have to be broad legalization. I mean, you could have something where it was like a special program for people with PTSD and like.
Yeah.
Where the doctors just go,
I'm not saying that's. Well, no. I mean, like, well, I don't know what it would take to make that happen.
Well,
right?
it'd be
like maybe
the DEA could actually do it by themselves. They could
like
reschedule the drugs and put it in the same category as Prozac.
You guys read that DEA thing on drugs, and you tell me that we're anywhere close to that because it's not happening.
Oh, I give them 0 credit.
Yeah, and they deserve 0 credit based on what I was reading. Genuinely. I don't mean to say
my favorite YouTube video of all time. This is another rabbit hole. This is not a rabbit hole, but whatever. Sidebar is a DEA agent at a junior high school who was sitting there in front of a bunch of students talking about how he's the only one in the school professional enough to carry a gun. He pulls it out and shoots himself in the leg.
Yes, I have. Yes, that is. That is amazing. And then tries to turn it.
And he's like, "Is everyone okay?"
Turn it into a teaching.
This is why.
This is why. Yeah. Oh my god.
Okay, good job, buddy.
That is amazing. Yeah. Yes. I think that might be a good note to end on. I would like to point out, by the way, there's an interesting fact on these psychedelics, by the way, that it's not the drugs themselves that are even remotely relevant. There's a number of different ways to get these psychedelic experiences, and that it is, if you don't get the psychedelic experience on the drug, you don't get the benefits. And if you get the psychedelic experience on a different drug or not using a drug at all, you get the benefits. So it appears not to be the drugs that are being taken that's relevant at all. It's the experience.
Well, makes sense. So what is an example of a time when you could get a psychedelic experience without the drug?
Well, they say you can get it through meditation. There's a tribe that apparently forces their there's a place kids on at puberty lay down on anthills, and ants bite them until they are bitten so much that they end up having a basic psychedelic experience, and that's at puberty they do that.
I think there's like Tweenaw meditation
fasting
or
is
something.
Another instance, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Is anyone interested in
DMT?
Doing drugs?
Well, yes, yeah. But
we all got really excited.
So I've been kind of interested in going to like a Vipassana retreat. Like, I don't know if you know
ayahuasca.
There's like a silent meditation retreat that lasts for like 10 days.
What state is it in? I need mountains. I don't want to do a beach.
Yeah.
If it's mountains, I'm in. Or desert.
I'll do it regardless. I'm interested in all experiences.
I mean, I need to send you guys an article. There was
There actually is one in Mexico.
There's a really interesting article I saw recently on, I don't know, do either of you guys read Hacker News or what? It's like a news aggregator.
Nerd alert.
Sounds cool.
Yeah. It's so cool. It's like but yeah, one of the there's actually like someone wrote like an essay on, and I'll give it to you guys later, and this is probably totally off subject, and please edit it out or whatever. But
I'm not going to edit any of this. It's just going to be one long, terrible podcast.
We're just gonna email.
Did we move forward or backwards from last week? I don't know.
I don't know either.
I did better this week.
This is definitely a better podcast. This is definitely a better podcast. But yeah.
Anyway, it's like kind of a more like it comes from like kind of like a more like analytically minded kind of like you might imagine like a software developer, some sort of someone engineer wrote like their impression of like like what their experience was like, but it's written from like kind of a technical standpoint. It's really fascinating to read. Like, I don't know if anyone is interested in meditation.
Man, I love it. Yeah.
Have you read Stuart's account of his ayahuasca trip?
No.
2-day ayahuasca trip, and the first one, awesome. It is really amazing. Yeah. I really wish Stuart were here for this. We need to have another drug. Why don't we just make this a drug podcast?
Yeah, we just do a bunch of drugs and start yelling at each other.
Do you guys want to wrap it up so you can go do some drugs?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Yeah, let's do it.
Drug life.
All right, ladies and gents. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah,
thanks everybody. Thanks.